Hello there, a very good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for watching Smart 24 TV. And my name is Anthony Sebale. You're watching, of course, the #1 show in analyzing economic policy and, of course, bringing, on board discussions that are still locked up somewhere in the boardrooms and getting to, of course, have feedback from you, our viewer, and analyze some of the points in these headlines. Now, of course, you can follow us on Twitter. That is at Smart24 TV. You can also follow me at Anthony Sebale and get to, of course, share the show and get to give us feedback. We'll be so grateful if we have that. Now, today, we are discussing real estate. Real estate business is one of the businesses that is considered lucrative here in Uganda. But also, when it comes to owning a home, in Uganda, I think it has become a Ugandan dream, just so like the American dream, to be able to own a property, to be able to own land. It is one of the goals of many people in Uganda today. But the business has been marred by several challenges, including ownership challenges, including, of course, fraud, and several other things that have actually ruined the business. But also looking at reports, the current state of housing in Africa highlights that there is an urgent need for solutions in the building and construction that need to be sustainable and, of course, made inclusive as well. And another report by UN Habitat, there's actually a magazine called UN Habitat. It says that 50% of sub-Saharan Africa will be living in towns or suburban areas in the next 10 years. That is at least by 2033. Now, primarily, this is due to the huge population growth that has been compounded by rural to urban migration. Now, today, joining me to discuss this topic is none other than Mr. Moses Lutalo. He is the managing director of Brol, and Brol is a real estate consultancy. So they're definitely going to add a lot to our discussion. You're most welcome to the show, Mr. Lutalo.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yes, I'm so glad to have you. Let's first of all start with the status quo of this real estate. As a real estate consultant, definitely I think on a day-to-day basis, you're faced with so many people in your office coming up to you, telling you about what they are looking out for, the challenges they are facing. But in general, speaking about real estate business, what would you say is, first of all, the scope currently? Who are the key stakeholders, and how has it evolved with time to the current status quo?
Thank you, Anthony. Hello, viewers. Now, when you talk about real estate, it's important that our viewers understand that as a business, real estate has so many stakeholders. I mean, from the time when you acquire that piece of land, you design that house, you get financing for that house, whether through mortgage or otherwise, you get contractors to build that house, to the point when you move in, to the point when you want to sell it, to maybe release equity. So there are players across the value chain. We have, consultants like Brol, and some of them can be architects, engineers, quantity surveyors, valuers, the real estate agents, brokers who get you the piece of land. There are banks that get involved in financing if you're going to do mortgage financing or, project financing for big projects. Then you have, people are going to get you tenants, people are going to manage that house for you if it's an investment. And, the lawyers that put all this together, and most recently also insurance companies have a role to play in the value chain. So every time you talk about real estate as an industry, as a sector, I think it's important that our viewers look at it from that perspective. That there are very many players and each one plays a role to make sure we have sustainable but planned development, which meets requirements from a regulatory perspective, but also that is decent enough, to live with. So on the back of that, and if you want to look at how this sector has evolved over the years, I mean, if you look at 10, 15 years ago, and I'll deal, because again, real estate, it is sector specific. You have different asset classes. For example, you have commercial property where you have offices. We have residential properties for prime experts, residential properties for middle income earners. Then we have industrial properties. We have student accommodation. We have shopping centers, we have hotels, we have, even listed vehicles for real estate. So those are the different asset classes. And every time, if you want to look at how the real estate market in Uganda is evolved over time, you need to look at those specifics. And I want to take you back to a journey of about maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I want to start with retail. Then we used to have only malls like Garden City, maybe, and, downtown, sort of malls. And we used to have Dukas. We didn't have formalized retail. Today we have the likes of Acacia Mall, we have Arena Mall. Then we used to have, residential, prime residential only in Nakasero, Kololo, Naguru, Bugolobi. Now we're seeing, neighborhoods opening up thanks to infrastructure development. We see people going as far as Nalia. People tell us 20 years ago, Nalia was almost, inaccessible. You wouldn't look at it as a prime location. Probably was not even existent then, but you see that trend. If you look at industrial, we used to talk about the 4th, 7th Street, 6th Street industrial area, Bugolobi. Now we're talking about Namamve because we have now the new industrial park coming up. If you look at commercial office space, we used to look at only Kololo, Nakasero, CBD. Now we're looking at Bugolobi, we're looking at Naguru, we're looking at Tinda, we're looking at Entebbe. All these places are coming up. So that's the sort of journey you'd want to see that the real estate has evolved through. But this has been primarily because of, from a physical planning perspective, what we'd call, competition, dominance, succession, evasion theory, where businesses start competing for each other. Where you used to have prime residential neighborhoods in Nakasero, now they're converted into office, areas. And because of that pressure, and the urban sprawl, you find that some services naturally will be pushed out of Kololo, out of Nakasero, and then others will take over. So where you used to have prime Kololo, where you have only ambassadors, today you have bars, you have commercial buildings. So because of that urban sprawl and the high urbanization rate is what has brought about this sort of pressure on the existing. And of course, what entities like Minister of Lands and KCC have done is to rezone. You've heard of rezoning some of these areas. Nakasero has been rezoned because now even the CBD is expanding. We're not talking about the greater Kampala metropolitan area, which has places like Mokono. All that is towards the expansion of the CBD. Urban high rates of urbanization, urban sprawl leading to that.
Well, interesting. When you talk about real estate, sometimes people think about only land and apartments and so on. But you mentioned that it has different, asset classes. You talk about the commercial, the residential, the retail. In Uganda, what do you think currently is the most trending or the most developing asset class when it comes to real estate business?
Well, that's a good one, Anthony. I think, no doubt, it will be housing because in your opening remarks, you mentioned about the housing deficit, which is not only a Ugandan problem, but it's an Africa-wide problem because of urbanization again. So you find that housing as a subsector and student accommodation are growing pretty fast. And it's because, really, if you think about it, the population growth rate, urbanization rates can only speak to that. So we've seen a lot of interventions, especially on the affordable housing side, from the big players like National Housing, like NSSF, but also private sector, because the Ugandan market is strongly driven by private sector. So without a doubt, housing is going pretty faster. If you, for example, took an example of Nalia, a satellite image of Nalia 15 years ago, and overlay it with today's image, you notice that there's been a lot of densification in those areas. It means more and more houses are coming up. Najera, Kira, Chiwatlo, those areas, which wasn't the case before. So, but that will now be followed by retail, naturally, because once people are there, they need to spend money to buy things. So retail is following up, then industrial, and then commercial office space in that sort of order.
Well, talk about the housing deficit. According to a report I read, the housing deficit in Uganda specifically, besides the one of Africa, which now continues to grow to about 238 million, that's the African housing deficit. The Ugandan housing deficit currently is at least 2.4 million units, out of which over about 210,000 units are actually in urban areas. and 1.395 million are in rural areas, and an estimated 900,000 units are substandard. And yet, now we are talking about more rural-urban migration and urbanization and KCCA upgrading the city. With all this pressure on housing and especially land, don't you think we are going to get to a point where we run out of options?
Yes and no. I think in terms of options, because we have quite a bit of land, we will still have people, living some sort of, shelter. It might not even be your planned neighborhoods and all that. But for me, at a personal level, I think we're already at that tipping point where we need strategic intervention. Because if you want to deal with housing challenges in Uganda, there are two things that you need to look at. You need to look at the supply side and the demand side. Now, on the demand side, the cost of accessing financing to own a home by way of mortgages is still very high. I mean, if you're getting mortgages at 18%, 16%, you cannot afford a mortgage. Not even for a house of 50 million shillings to many people. So that's one area. And I think last year when His Excellency was launching Global Housing Project, he did point to some of these things. And I remember him putting to task Housing Finance Bank to look into that. So you're dealing with the demand side. Now, on the supply side, what are the challenges that developers are facing to deliver decent housing to Ugandans? One will be infrastructure. Because if I'm buying land in Chitukutwe, where there's no national water, the roads are still, impassable, the cost of putting infrastructure in place is on the developer, which now makes it expensive because when you're pricing your house, if I'm a developer and I'm putting up 200 units in Chitukutwe, I have to make sure the cost of infrastructure is in, the cost of land is in, my margins markup is in and everything. So if government was to strategically continue doing what they're doing, opening up more and more neighborhoods, then we'll find that if roads are there, water is there, that's a starting point. So you're dealing with the supply problems. Then, of course, the things like alternative technologies, Every day we're talking about bricks and mortar. It takes you maybe 6 months or even a year if you had money to finish your house. But if you're using, modular ways of construction, it will take a quicker, way. So you can deliver many houses in a shorter time, which saves the investors money. But to do that premier sort of project in Uganda, you need scale. Investor will tell you, I need a minimum of 2,000 units if I'm going to deliver affordable housing technology. Now, for an investor to do that without guaranteed offtake in terms of purchases, because the mortgages are unaffordable, it's not attractive. So for me, the 17 years I've been in this sector, I've attended so many conferences on affordable housing. And these are the same things we've talked about. For me, I think there has to be action. And government is doing what they can in terms of opening up infrastructure, but us, the players, we need now to sit down with the value chain players and say, okay, if you're a construction company, what are your challenges? How do we intervene? If it is a size thing, can we reduce the sizes of houses? Ugandans want space, we want to have compounds and all that. Can we afford it? Maybe not. Maybe not the locations you want. So once more and more neighborhoods are opening up and we incentivize the investors into the sector, and incentives could be by way of putting in bulk infrastructure, could be by way of looking at the taxation, the tax regime. There's a very important component to housing, which is the VAT. I'll tell you, if you're building a house and you're buying materials, cement, everything with VAT, you don't pass on that VAT, it's a sunk cost. So I'll sell you my house when I've built in the VAT. Yet when I'm doing a commercial property, that VAT is recoverable because tenants are paying me plus VAT. So again, there's something you can do on the taxation to just make sure. But also, awareness, working with, even us as Ugandans, you need to save money, because when you save, you have access to a big pool of money, which now you can be, lent to at, minimal interest rates. For as long as we're relying on commercial banks to finance, housing, to finance real estate, there's always going to be a mismatch between, the two.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, interesting. Before we go into the break, talking about financing for a home, mortgages are quite hefty when it comes to costs and, of course, the investment they're in. But there are different options to, for example, acquire property. As a consultant in real estate, from your own experience, where do you think Ugandans should be headed in terms of financing? Because this is one of the big elephant in the room. We might, walk around and say, okay, we're trying to provide affordable housing, but still, housing is expensive. Yeah. You've seen the NSSF houses. You've seen the price tags, right? Yes. And trust me, if you're not working in government or something and with a big job, you definitely don't even dream about having a house like in Lugoa. Yeah. Now, talk about financing. Should someone really go out for a mortgage? When should someone go for a mortgage? When should someone go for a salary loan? And when should someone actually make an investment and say, okay, I'm going to build brick by brick, as I also get to acquire a home?
Yeah. Well, that's a very touchy question, and occasionally people have been, raising this. There's ways of looking at this. I mean, depends on what your risk appetite is as an individual and also your return objectives. Because if you work, for example, in a bank or these huge financial institutions, insurance companies, I'm told that staff have access to mortgages as low as 10%. So definitely when you are out of university and you get a job in one of the big insurance companies or pension funds or banks, it might be attractive for you to get a mortgage at 10%. Because then you're moving into your house, you're not going to, and you're building equity in there. Because the way you build a housing, sector, you don't start from up like you've done in Uganda. You start from the bottom. So I come out of university, I can afford a house of 80 million shillings. I get a mortgage for that. Maybe I pay,
Maybe you can break it down for our viewers, because we might be talking about mortgage, and there's a viewer out there who doesn't differentiate a mortgage and a loan.
A loan. Okay, maybe for clarity purposes, thank you. A mortgage is where you take out long-term financing as an individual over a period of time, maybe between 10 to 20 years, and you own property. That property is owned by the institution that has given you that money until you pay up all that, the mortgage over time. And more than often, people refinance those mortgages. You buy this property, it gains value, then you sell it at some point, buy another one like that. And this is very common for even advanced markets. That's why when the 2008 financial crisis globally happened, was because of that mortgage-backed securities and all these things that happened. So real estate is a very touchy aspect, because it affects,
to put it in perspective, you have a company you're working for, or a company you're not actually working for, but they own a property, and then you're going to maybe work for them, or you're going to be paying them a certain amount of money, either monthly, annually, or something like that, and you possess that property for that period of time.
Actually, what happens is you work for company X. They tell you, okay, if you identify a property within, say, 50 to 120 million shillings, we'll offer a mortgage for 15 years. So what the company will do, it will work with a financial institution, if it's not a bank directly. If I'm a pension fund, I'll work with a bank and say, okay, underwrite for me this one. Find out, is the land okay? Is the title fine? Is the price right? So they'll underwrite that. The bank will give you the money, but your company will subsidize that mortgage for you. So you move straight away into your house. Instead of paying that rent to the landlord, you're paying it towards your house that you own over a period of time. So, and what normally happens is, because for those institutions, preferential rates, they tend to have their people for long term. Because if you've taken out a mortgage for 20 years, you don't want to leave after 3 years and then it goes back to 18%. So you sort of bond your employees for some time. So that's how the mortgage works. So basically it's you own the property because you're paying towards equity towards it every time until you retire the mortgage over a period of time. And usually in Uganda, it's even interesting. Many people pay before the 15 years. You find that
by 15 years, they have already paid up.
Earlier than that, because you have an informal market. People are doing a business, they're doing this, that. So as you get more money, so if your installment is 1 million shillings a month, but you get a bonus of 5, you can put 3 more upfront. So it reduces your tenor, like I call it, the period for which year. Mortgage is it's an easier way of, sort of.
So salary loan versus mortgage.
The little mathematics I've done around the mortgage, I know for a fact any mortgage beyond 12% in Uganda shillings does not make business sense for anyone, because it becomes so expensive over time. Because remember, the first maybe 8 years of paying interest before you even start paying. So it only makes sense if it's below 12%, then you can start seeing the numbers. Because if you look at the houses, an average affordable home in, say, Nadia is like 400 million shillings.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you do the mathematics,
10%, that's about 40 million. So if you're doing 12%, above 12%,
Yeah.
that means you're paying more than 50 million probably.
no, over time, but if the repayment, because also there's a cap, you shouldn't be able to service a mortgage for more than 40% of your monthly earnings. So if I'm earning 5 million shillings, I shouldn't be able to spend more than 40% of my 5 million shillings on a mortgage. You find that beyond 12%, you can even spend 70% of your earnings on a mortgage.
Wow.
So you're supposed to, as a financial advisor, out there they have, mortgage originators and all that. They're supposed to tell you, look here, you cannot afford this mortgage. Yes, you love this house, it's beautiful, but if you're spending more than 60% of your earnings paying it, it's not sustainable because you have a family, you have medical bills and all that. Yeah. So the pricing is a problem. And the reason why it is a problem, Ugandans are not saving enough money. We're not saving enough money. And even when we're saving...
Mr. Lutalo, people are saving. I've seen people save to the point that they save 50% of their earnings. And they will tell you still, honestly, authentically, I'm not able to afford the house.
Agreed, because that's one person saving. Imagine if the entire country was saving like that.
Oh, yeah.
We'll have a pool of money which now can do this. Now, many times people look at the saving schemes. When you're in a circle, I'm sure you're in one of the circles, they'll tell you, put aside $1 million shillings every month, let's save it and invest. Now, those people will not get that money and put it in real estate or lend it for mortgage purposes because the interest rates are low compared to when you put the money in government treasuries and with less risk. So until we reach a point where there's so much capital available that it no longer makes sense to put money in, listed companies, government treasuries, then people will say, oh, where else do you put money? I'm NSSF. I'm sure you're seeing now NSSF, they have to do the work because if you have, 14 trillion shillings now or thereabouts, how much of that are you going to put in, fixed income, securities, in listed companies? How many companies do you have? So all of a sudden you have all this cash available to you and you have nowhere to deploy it. So you now start being creative on the real estate because it's long-term investment. So for as long as we're lacking enough savings, we will not drive our mortgage rates down because all of us are competing for that little saving that is available in the market.
Wow, thank you very much, Mr. Lutalo. We are going to take a very short break and we return shortly. Well, the discussion today is on real estate. We are talking, of course, different options you have for yourself to get a home and get yourself that property that you've always dreamt about. How can you maneuver the challenges and be able to still access the property? Now, Mr. Lutalo, when we return, we want to talk about a very critical aspect of real estate, and that is ownership. There have been quite a number of issues where people have been able to buy a property and in the end they found out they actually bought nothing at all. How can someone know they're in total absolute possession of a property? When should they actually declare that? And who are the people to actually help them along the way when someone wants to access a property? Because I understand one of the worries also is getting to the right people, getting to know who to deal with. And we have so many people now in the sector, like you mentioned, consultants, brokers, the actual owners of the properties, and sometimes it gets confusing. And then later on we want to divulge a little bit into the aspect of ownership but also rent. There's been a gap between people who are renting and people who own actually the property. When should someone cross to the other side? Because at some point people feel like moving to the other side, but they cannot afford to. How can they plan in eventuality of the fact that they have to move to ownership to move successfully to that category? My name is Anthony, and of course, stay with us. More is yet to come in our next session.